law, that is cybersecurity law, that is AI law, the famous Data Act and the Digital Service Act, very important regulations. And we compare these regulations to the parallel situation in China and America. And at the end of that, you're writing a final essay. We already had 20 people from the TSUL, from your university, participating in the first round of the lectures. We will have a meeting at 4 o'clock here in this room. So if you're interested in more details, come at 4 o'clock. So here. And I found even a very intelligent coordinator, manager, because she is from Uzbekistan as well, and she has prepared several videos in Uzbek language in order for you to introduce. But perhaps we have 5 minutes left. Can you introduce yourself?
Neyse kaçıncı kursdan ayrılışlar sınavda bakmayı. Stipendiya bitti. Germanya'nın Bremen Üniversitesi'nde magistraturu eğitim. Bundan keyin Germaniyadagi bir qancha banklarning bo'limlari Commerzbanklar, Schweiz Bank, Fundungen, Financial Products GmbH va Birjan bilsalar kerak Germaniyadagi Deutsche Börse lekin ta'lim loyihalarida xalqaro proyektlarda ishtirok etgan. Hozirgi kunda professor doktor ana shu xalqaro bizneslarning malakasini oshirish programmasini O'zbekistonda ham O'zbekiston bilan hamkorlikmiz. Yordam beraman va shu O'zbekiston
Ular bilan tekin programmasi bor deb 1 yil bo'ladi, onlayn bo'ladi. Soat 4da o'sha programma bo'yicha tushuntirish olib boradi. Bu o'sha katta programmani bitta bizaniki yuridik universitetda o'zi bitta man bo'lgani uchun chiqib qolgan o programmaga. Atak 4ta universitetda dars beradi. Bu dunyodagi top 100 degan universitetlar bor. Mana biz 1000 deymiz, boshqa 500 deymiz. Buni universiteti top 100 ga kiradi. Buni uchraydiganlar tam 3ta universitet bor. O'sha eng qari universitetlarni Yevropaning eng qari universitetlariga kiradi. Avstriyskiy universitet, Germaniya universiteti. How many universities we joined for?
Three major one, Munich and Cologne, and we are number 3.
Yeah. 3ta asosiy, keyin 4-inchisi buniki, 5-chi bizning universitet qo'shilib 5ta universitet bilan mana shu programma bor. Bu keyinchalik o'zi programma bo'lib ketishi mumkin. Dunyo bo'yicha tanilgan, bu hamma o'sha Yevrosoyuzni deputatlari o'rtasida o'sha leksiya o'qiydi. O'sha uchun buni programmasi juda ham prestijli hisoblanadi.
So we managed to find. Thank you for being here in Tashkent. Thank you for being in Germany, wherever you are. And welcome to the next session of LDE on the digital market. Tashkent experts. I will first introduce the expert from the European Commission, Gunnar Wolf. He's my master student, my best student in the area of writing a doctoral thesis. Then he started his career as an advocate and then went to the Commission to climb one of the leading experts
Good morning. Looks like we lost the sound.
So then we skip to Gulyamov, a very close friend of mine, and her really highly sophisticated expert in every question of cyber law. Is Mr. Cyber Law #1 in Central Asia. Let us start with Gunnar Wolf. I hope we see each other and we can listen to you. And the session starts with you now.
So let's start now. So let's see, why isn't that presentation? Now it's going. All right, so I will give a presentation on the EU Digital Markets Act, and then Professor Gulyamov will compare the DMA with the situation in Central Asia. I have a lot of slides, so warning, you have something to bring home. And through some of them, I will have to go quickly. If you have burning questions, feel free to ask, but I think we also have enough time at the end. There's some echo now. Let's see. So let's see. There's a slight echo. Are we better now? Well, let me see. So I will spend about 5 minutes to set up the discussion, tell you a bit about something about competition in digital markets and then how we ultimately arrived at the DMA. And then I will go quickly through the main features of the DMA. So the scope, the obligations that the gatekeepers under the DMA have to comply with, a bit on compliance and enforcement, and because it's topical, also a bit because we just published a report about the review of the DMA. So we had the first review that we have to do to Parliament and Council was published last week. So a bit about how why is there DMA in the first place, right? So, and for that, I have to start a bit about what's so special about competition in digital markets. So they exhibit certain features, and most of them are not new, and people have been writing about them for decades. And one also has to be fair that not all of these features appear in our markets, and also that their presence does not always mean that they're strong positions that can never be overcome. But they have, I mean, these features have helped creating very remarkably stable positions in some markets. And one of the key issues is, for competitors, it's regularly not enough to come up with a better or cheaper product. You need other things. So if you look a bit at those features, one of them is very strong network effects, which basically means a product or service becomes more valuable the more people use it. So for instance, there's direct network effects. Think about social networks. The more of your friends are in a network, the greater is the value for you. So if you have the greatest app ever, but none of your friends are there for social media, then it's pretty much useless for you. And then there are also indirect network effects, which are basically dependencies between products. So think about operating system applications. If you develop an app, then you will want to write for the most popular operating system because that's where your customers will be. And on the other hand, end users will also want the operating systems where the most apps are. So if you have the greatest operating system ever, but there's basically no app and nobody will use it, then not worth much. All this can lead to the market's tip. So basically that means the winner takes it all or most. I mean, sometimes there can also be more than two winners, but there's a reason why you don't have many operating systems, right? So if you think about PCs, that basically is Windows with a little bit of Mac, and maybe for some aficionados, then you still have some open source, but that's basically it. And Windows has had a market share of close to 90% for a very long time. And the same you see in mobile with Android and iOS. Then another thing that you see on those markets are so they're multi-sided. Basically, platforms bring often different users together. So you can, as I said, we already had the operating system as an example. Another one would be, think about YouTube. So you have content providers, you have the viewers, and you have advertisers. And that can create a sort of gatekeeping power for platforms. And we will talk a little bit about that in a short while. Another thing that's very important in those markets is data. So It's often an input and an output of services, and that then can create feedback loops. Many of these services need data, and then a lot of it. Think about search engines or digital advertising. And the flip side of this is, of course, that having access to that data is very important. So if you don't have access to the data, then that can be a market entry barrier that you cannot overcome. We see that also right now playing out in AI again. Another feature is that you see substantial economies of scale and scope. So if economies of scales are basically advantages that an undertaking has because of the size of the operation. So for most of these services, you have very high fixed costs. So it costs a lot to write the code, but then very low or zero marginal costs. So adding another user doesn't cost you anything. It's basically setting up the whole thing. And then for scope, it's basically, so scope advantages is, the total cost of production goes down as a result of the increasing number of products and services. So think about Amazon and all the things that run on its data centers. As a result of these phenomena, you often see lock-in of business or end users and switching costs. So people are locked in and they don't switch even if there are better alternatives, right? So that's, for instance, one of the things that people claim with respect to cloud services. So it's not even if you could switch, it's not easy to switch because they all have their idiosyncrasies. You need to rewrite a fair amount of code, and you need to spend millions if you want to switch your cloud provider. Then another thing that you see in these markets a lot is a conglomerate structure or a form of vertical integration. So digital platforms often have gatekeepers for downstream services. And of course, if they also provide that downstream services, then they have an incentive to leverage their platform power into other services. So think about Google, which has many things, but for instance, of course, the cash cow is search. Then it has browsers, which is the main entry point for search. Then it has Android OS, which basically it has configured to run on Google search. And of course, it has all kinds of vertical searches, so shopping, travel, local, and I guess maps. You could also point to that. So then the final point that's also very important from those markets is that innovation competition is particularly important. You can have innovation that can create completely new goods and services. And they can also make existing services and services obsolete. And potential competition and the entrance via niche markets are also of a particular importance. Now, what does it mean for competition law? So, these markets pose some challenges to staples of competition law, which are market definition, market power, and new forms of behavior. So for market definition, we often wonder, some people wonder whether you still need to define markets because it's very complicated. Often these markets have many sides, and then it's very difficult to see how to define a market within the entire ecosystem. As a result, it's also sometimes not so easy to gauge market power in the overall ecosystem. Services are often free, which is a problem for certain forms of economics where you do have to do some math. And then, as I said before, so data is very important. Of course, we also have new forms of behaviors. So think about the Google Shopping case, where we had a self-preferencing, where the vertical search results were not going through the normal algorithm. But of course, that also happens in others. So that's not so, as I said, those are challenges, but I would think these challenges can be overcome. But now we come to things that are a bit more complicated. And one is the speed of the market. So the technology and the commercial developments develop very quickly. For instance, think about the money that's currently invested in AI, and you get very dizzy. But of course, competition cases, unfortunately, take time. Some take more than others. But the risk is always that by the time you come to a decision, it's too late. So the market is tipped, and then it's very difficult to remedy because it's not so easy to get the genie back into the bottle. Another point, and that's more of a macro than a micro issue, I guess, is the growing economic concentration. And it's not only competition. You have there were lots of studies published by economists showing that markups were going up. You see less entry. Again, that's not everywhere. For instance, AI is probably, that's certainly a recent exception. And you also see in many of these markets a bit less of innovation, or rather a different direction of innovation. So that's sometimes also called the innovator's dilemma. So you don't want to do an innovation that risks the golden goose that lays your golden eggs. And maybe one more point. Also, recent events also show that, as I said, it goes beyond competition, right? So economic power can then also lead to political power. You will have very powerful companies lobbying against legislation or enforcement, even if that enforcement happens in other countries. You will have companies writing manifestos, and there's also a question of democratic control. And then maybe a final point, of course, competition law is also not a panacea, so shouldn't be used to address all kinds of regulatory issues. Evidently, competition law can take other regulation into account. It actually will have to, because that will define how competition is possible. Competition law can also inform regulation. So some regulation is built on learnings from competition proceedings. So you have the credit card inter-exchange fees, the DMA that we're talking about today is also a good example. But of course, it's not a panacea, right? So competition law cannot try to address competition aspects of, let's say, AI. So if you want to make sure that Skynet is not killing all the humans, then don't rely on competition law. So this slide I borrowed from a colleague, and it always makes me smile because it has a very assertive language. Basically, that's the situation that we had before the DMA. So the Commission had done a fair amount of cases. And it's true, we have probably, compared to other major jurisdictions, we have done a lot. But we also have, some of the cases took too long. There are reasons for that, but also a lot of things didn't change on the ground, so not in the core markets at least. So think about Google search, but the position has been relatively unchanged since a very long time. And there was a global, or at least European discontent. I mean, but it was not only in Europe. So we had a lot of reports also from many other jurisdictions, even in the US, even though at the time of the first Trump administration. But there was a Stiegler report where you had a lot of very prominent former US antitrust enforcers. So there was as I said, there was a bit of a discontent with the situation. Our commission at the time was certainly not happy. She commissioned a group of special advisors that wrote a report. Other people also wrote reports. And so we were a bit in a crisis. And the idea came up, as I said, Parliament was also unhappy. Some of the member states also had started to reforms, for instance, in Germany. And as I said, there was at the early 2000s, there was a sort of groundswell coming up. And within the commission, the idea was also that it was time to change gears, so move from a ex post, where basically you come in after the infringement is taken, to a more ex-ante solution. And the focus was on contestability and fairness, so basically create the proper incentives to innovate for all within digital markets. And if you look, well, I should have switched that a bit earlier. So that's the slide. That's the slide I was talking about. Then, if you look at the central objectives of the digital markets, the first point, contestability, is basically that there were entrenched positions of many services, and what we wanted to achieve is to lower the barriers so that companies can change the existing gatekeepers again on their merits. Because the problem that you see in many of these markets is that there's a great imbalance of bargaining power, and as a result, these gatekeepers can take advantage and impose unfair terms. And EU competition law could only interfere or intervene in cases of abuse of dominance, and the DMA also can try, at least in certain aspects, to tackle structural issues as such. So, for instance, data accumulation. Fairness, as I already alluded to, is basically tackles the differences in bargaining power. So you don't need dominance. You also need an effect on competition. It's more a dependency relationship. And another point that's very important, not at least to the legal basis, is basically harmonization, that you have a uniform set of rules that are directly applicable everywhere in the EU, instead of having potentially 27 different systems. Now, if you think about the three key features, then is only the very largest platforms will be designated as gatekeepers, and these gatekeepers then need to comply ex ante with the obligations, which is a list of do's and don'ts, and you have enforcement at EU level. I mean, as I said, the DMA is not a panacea, so competition law remains applicable as well. And of course, you have all kinds of other regulations. So for data protection, you have GDPR. For illegal content and transparency and risk of platforms, you have the DSA, and so on. Let's now go to the scope of the DMA. So the first thing that you will have that determines the scope is the notion of a core platform service. If you want to know more about how we came up with that list, there's an impact assessment on the DMA which explains a bit. It's basically highly concentrated, multi-sided platform services where you usually have one or very few large digital platforms that set the commercial conditions on that platform. And if you look at this, so you'll see the usual suspects. So there's not much surprise. So online intermediation services, you have app stores or marketplaces, search engines, social networking, video sharing, messaging, operating systems. The Parliament during the legislative process then added browsers and virtual assistants, and one of the more problematic things or more difficult things is sometimes to delineate where does a service end, and for that you'll see there's an annex also in the DMA which explains that a bit more how this is done. Now, of course, having such a service in itself is not enough because then we would have a lot. You also need to be a gatekeeper. So in order to be a gatekeeper, you have the overarching requirements in Article 3.1. So you need a significant impact on the internal market. So the gatekeeper must provide one of these core platform services that is an important gateway for business users to reach end users. And then the position needs to be entrenched and durable. Then in order to do that, there are two different methods. So one is quantitative and the other one is qualitative. So the first one you see also on the slide in Article 3.2, that's the quantitative. There's a rebuttable presumption, and the gatekeeper will have to notify within 3 months after fulfilling these thresholds. And you see, so it's 75 billion turnover, 7.5 turnover in the EU, or 75 billion capitalization in at least 3 member states needs to be active. You will need 45 million end users and 10,000 business users, and the stability and entrenchment criterion is supposed to be fulfilled if these 45 million, 10,000 users have been reached in the last 3 financial years. Then you have also a purely qualitative one, and we'll get to this in this slide, which is basically also a mechanism for, well, we can actually go back. So you have one for correcting false positives. So within the notification, if you as a gatekeeper say, okay, I as a company say I fulfill these criteria, but I don't think I'm a gatekeeper, you can file with the notification a rebuttal. And the reason for that is, many of these core platform services are quite different. Some of them you use probably, each of you will use many times daily. Think about browser search. For others, not so much. And so there's a way of calibrating what actually is a gatekeeper. So, and then once we receive such a rebuttal with a notification, we have 45 days. And what we can do is we can either reject outright, and we have done that in certain cases, and then designate. We can accept, and then there's no designation, and you see some examples there, such as Samsung browsers. And then for certain cases where on the basis of the notification and the rebuttal we are not so sure, we can open a market investigation and then look into this and then come out either way again. Now, as I said, there's another corrective, basically for the purely qualitative. So it can be that the company is below the thresholds that we just discussed, but it can still be a gatekeeper. And then the way that this will be done is we look again at the criteria in 3.1. So those are the ones that need to be fulfilled. There's some elements in Article 3.8 which will explain a bit further, how to assess these criteria in 3.1. And for that, then we would need a fully fledged market investigation of 12 months. So proper investigation with request for information, everything. And at the end, we can designate. So far, we have done this in one case for iPadOS, and there's 2 ones ongoing right now with respect to Microsoft Azure and Amazon Web Services. So if you look at the overall picture, so far we have 7 gatekeepers with 23 core platform services. We have undesignated 1, Facebook Marketplace, but those are basically the current gatekeepers that we have. Now, let's look a bit at the obligations. So there are many, we're not going into all of them. Professor Gulyamov will actually mention some, so we can talk about others as well a bit later if you want to. So if you look at the obligations, there are different ways of grouping them, right? So you can do it via addressees, because some are specific to certain core platform services, some apply to all. You can do via type of practice. What we've done in the Act is basically we have the obligations, the main substantive obligations in Article 5, 6, and then the Parliament added in Article 7. The main difference between Article 5 and 6 are, so the Article 5 ones are the ones that are a bit more clear-cut, more mainly behavior where the gatekeeper should not engage in, or behavior that third parties should be allowed to do. And in Article 6, they tend to be a bit more susceptible to further specification. So there are often things that the gatekeeper has to do, so not only a mere cease and desist. But again, there's no point in if the gatekeeper has to do it, it's just how, right? It's basically often things like data access. So there's different ways how you can do the data access, so how you can give access to that data, and that then can be specified exactly how to be done. And in Article 7, that's the one that the Parliament added, that's basically interoperability between messaging services. So if you look at the map here, you see that's done via types, right? So you have some related to data, you have interoperability, you have mobile ecosystems, commercial relations, tying for access. There's a lot, so we're not going into all of them today. As I said, we might come back to some a little bit later. One thing maybe worth noting is, so they're different from competition law in the sense that the DMA is an ex-ante tool. So the goal was to bring as much as possible legal certainty up front on what is allowed or not allowed for certain players. And so sometimes, the language gives a bit of a tortured reading. So it happens even to me. So I always have to reread. Very careful, also read the recitals, because they're very narrow, right? It's basically the flip side of having something ex ante. So there's no broad catch-all, but they're relatively precise. But that's also that's intention, because it was supposed to capture only things of which we are certain that they have negative effects. So, and I will also go very briefly only on this. So if you think about the intended benefits of the DMA, they actually mirror the obligations. So one of the things we were worried about was to have more contestability around app stores, so that there can be alternative payment systems, or that there actually can also be alternative app stores on iOS. Then certain forms of self-preferencing are no longer possible. So we have ongoing proceedings against Google and Amazon in that respect. The intention was also that there should be increased interoperability and get more contestability on operating systems that have been relatively closed. Another thing is that we didn't want, we didn't want to have non-consensual data combination, which happened a lot before. Another thing, which was also based on our experience from an antitrust case, was we did not want to have the possibility that the gatekeeper uses data from the business user that operates on the platform to compete against that business user. And another thing is that, which was always difficult, is much easier now, even if we're not maybe finally there yet, is that business users and end users can get their data out of the platform and transfer and actually then switch more easily to another platform. If you want to get a feeling on where we are with all these, you can read the recent review report that I mentioned, which will give you a good overview of what we have done and what we haven't done. Now, On compliance and enforcement, so once a gatekeeper is designated, then they have 6 months to be in compliance with the obligations that apply to them. The intention was always on our end to create a compliance culture. So the gatekeepers publish compliance reports. They also actually have within the company now a compliance function. And what we would like to get is to get to a compliance by design. So not that company comes with a new product and then figures out, oh, how do I make that DMA compatible? But basically that they already think about this when they conceive the product. What we do a lot is what has been dubbed a regulatory dialogue. So we talk a lot to gatekeepers and third parties to see that we can come to a solution or to a compliance with the obligations that works for everyone. What we also do, we encourage the gatekeepers to directly deal with third parties. So what we don't want them is to basically sit somewhere, cook something up, and then come and say, well, this is our solution now. We would rather like them to talk to the market before and market test a bit before they come to us. Non-compliance has serious consequences. So it's basically the old approach of speak softly but carry a big stick. We can impose up to 20% of global turnover if there's repeat infringement. We can also impose periodic penalty payments if there's no compliance. So basically that adds up a fine every day there's non-compliance. And in extreme cases, so if there's systematic non-compliance, we can also add other measures, which could be also of structural nature. So we could also basically split off parts of the company if justified. Now, if you look at the if you look at compliance so far, so we have non-compliance cases. We have 6 open last year. We closed 3 since. 3 are ongoing. We have the first decisions with a fine, but it's not the end. The gatekeepers have changed their behavior in terms somewhat. We're currently assessing that. We also have those 2 cases in court. And these proceedings should also only be seen as the tip of the iceberg, because, as I said, we have the regulatory dialogue, which is much wider, right? And so we talk to these companies all the time. And we're getting also results that don't get much coverage. So, for instance, one of the things that's now possible is the transfer, as I said, of user data, or for instance, also the eSIM card, can now be transferred from Android to iPhone. Another thing that we have is the specification proceedings that I mentioned. So we have done 2 so far with respect to iOS, and we have 2 ongoing. So one is for with respect to Google Android, the operating system, so that rival AI providers have the same access as Gemini. And then we have another one which relates to Google's search data. So under the DMA, one of the obligations is that companies, so basically rival search engines, can have access to anonymize Google search data. And AI providers also, you will have noticed, they all also have now a search component. And for that search component, they are also very interested in getting that data so that they can compete with Google and its Gemini on an equal footing. Only very briefly, so the enforcement and investigative tools are pretty much the same as in antitrust proceedings. So we have requests for informations, we have inspections. A couple of things that differ is, for instance, so we have now retention orders. So basically all companies have a policy, internal policy under which they will delete emails. Sometimes that time is very short. So if you come late, you will not find anything anymore. So what we can do is we can order these companies to hold their emails and other documents, so that if we come with a request for information, they cannot say, sorry, we deleted all the emails. As I said, for fines, one of the new things is that we can, in case of recidivism, we can go up to 20%. Under the antitrust rules, is only 10%. We also have the systematic compliance issue, and we also have some future proofing. We can do market investigations into other services or practices on the basis of which we can do either delegated acts, so we can basically do a commission change of or addition of the DMA, or we can go back to the legislator and basically on the basis of this report and then tell them, well, we need something new. Now quickly, because I'm getting to the end of my 30 minutes, the review of the DMA, as I said, very topical because we published last week. So the overall picture is, so there's an early positive impact. If you look at the timeline, the obligations under the DMA have been applicable for 2 years for most of the gatekeepers. And some of the expected benefits have been realized. So, as I said, that were the expected ones. And as I said, if you want to have a good feeling, look at that report. So, for instance, there is now a more meaningful choice when data is combined. We made progress for transferring data outside of ecosystems. Alternative browser providers are happy because they managed to increase their share following choice screens. We also have now the first alternative app stores on iOS. Another thing would be that the interoperability, so the access to features of the operating system and the hardware on iOS and Android devices have been improved. And so the overall conclusion is that the DMA is fit for purpose. So we will not reopen the regulation at this stage. At the same time, it's also fair to say that we're not done yet. If we really want to reap all these expected benefits, there needs to be continued strict enforcement. What you will also find in the report, and also not a surprise, is in terms of features of points of focus for the future. There's cloud and AI, and we have already begun. So we have 3 market investigations currently in the cloud sector. We have 2 specifications proceedings that relate to artificial intelligence, and we also have 2 antitrust cases related to AI. What we will also do is a targeted adjustment of some of the procedure rules that we can do without reopening the DMA. So that relates, for instance, to some of the templates that we use for reporting. And then another thing that we want to try is to increase a bit the transparency so that the outside world, in particular also business users, have a better idea of where we are in some of the regulatory dialogues. So if you're interested in updates on where this goes, our website is actually quite good for commission standards. So I have to praise that site. It's relatively usable for commission standards. It's also up to date always, and you find many things. And of course, there are others. So there's services we have to pay for, like MLEX, but there are also others like Verge. So if you want to follow this, that's where you can find interesting things on where we are going. And with that, I'm ending my presentation and pass it over.
Can you stop?
Should work now.
That was hard stuff for you, coming from Uzbekistan. It's even hard stuff for Germans, non-German lawyers. So don't feel embarrassed if you have not understood any construction, but perhaps the world will be better with Said.
Yeah.
He's Mr. One in the world of Central Asia and cyber law. And again, I'm happy to be here as his friend.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me start my presentation. First of all, assalamu alaikum. Hello to everybody, dear colleagues, and who is joining us online and in person. Hello, students and teachers here. I'd like to welcome Professor Gunnar Wolf and to thank Professor Thomas Hoeren for the opportunity to speak in this distinguished forum. You just heard the European perspectives on the Digital Market Act. Allow me to offer you from the 5,000 kilometers east, from the market that consume digital services without producing a single gatekeeper. I address one research question. Can recipient markets adopt the specific DMA institution without the replicate the entire regulatory architecture? My thesis, they can through the localization, what I can call selective transplantation. My method is functional comparison of the traditional of German scholarship, a tradition well known in this university. The Oliver Brand published his influential work on comparative methodology. I do not ask whether Central Asia states have a digital market act. I ask whether they possess legal instruments that perform the same regulatory function. I apply this method against the three core DMA innovations, which I will define on the next slide. A comparison paper with the 90 verified legal acts supports this presentation. Let me now frame with the structure protocol. This table defines a structural asymmetry. The European Union has 7 designated gatekeepers, 5 of them American. Central Asia has 0 gatekeepers. Not a single company in our region meets the threshold of the Article 3. Every dominant digital service organized abroad. The regulatory challenges is therefore fundamentally different. The European Union restricts gatekeepers' power from the within. We must protect 84 million consumers against foreign platforms, dominating without a domestic counterpart to regulate. This requires a different regulatory philosophy, non-replication but adaptation. What then is the benchmark? I isolated 3 DMA innovations in my analytical framework because none of them exist in the Central Asia. First, ex-ante per se obligation, prohibition that apply before harm occurs. Second, interoperability mandates requiring dominant messaging platform to open their infrastructure. Third, data portability rights, enabling users to transfer their information between services. Note the timing. Article 53 requires the commissions to evaluate the DMA by the May. 2 days ago.
Only the slides are not shown to the public here.
No,
Here as well, but not.
They can see.
There you see. Still stand on slide 1. One moment. Be relaxed.
If not, I can upload the slides and do it for the others, if that's easier.
Yeah, I sent the slides yesterday to all, so you can see the slides. So there we are.
Is it correct now?
Ja, zo verder.
No. Okay. Let me start again. I isolated the three DMA innovation in my analytical benchmark because none of them exist anyway in Central Asia. First, ex-ante obligation, recognition that applied before the harm occurred. Second, interoperability mandate, requiring a dominant messaging platform to open the infrastructure. Third, data portability rights, enabling users to transfer the information between services. Note the timing. Article 53, as you can see, requires the Commission to evaluate DMA by the 3rd of May, 2 days ago. We just, Professor, talked about that. And we discussed this regulation at the precise moment the European Union itself is questioning whether it works. The regional picture follows. This matrix is the empirical foundation. Three findings emerged. First, only Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan possesses the minimum institutional framework. First, three competition authorities with the digital competence, platform definitions in the statute, AI regulation, and data protection law. Second, no state in the region has enacted any per se obligation targeting platform conducting specialists. There is no in Central Asia like obligation. Third, this may surprise European colleagues. Uzbekistan established an operational AI regulatory sandbox in 2021, 3 years before the European Union finalized its own under the AI Act. The gradient across the 5 countries is striking. Let me show you. Central Asia is not a single regulatory space. It's a 5-stage spectrum. Uzbekistan leads with approximately 75% functional coverage of DMA objectives. Kazakhstan follows the roughly 60%. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan occupy the middle ground with emerging frameworks. Turkmenistan, very low percentage, faced with unique challenges of building foundation market institution before digital specific regulation become meaningful. This display means identical policy perceptions would be the counterproductive. Each jurisdiction demands a tailored approach calibrated to its institutional reality. This brings us to the constitutional lawyer, the deepest status. Constitutional foundation. Before using the statutory instruments, I established the normative foundation. Uzbekistan's 2023 constitution, adopted by the national referendum, ensures competitive protection at the highest legal level. Article 65 explains couples of fair competition with consumer priority, a formulation without a precise analog even in the European Union Charter. Article 67 mandates that monopolistic activity be regulated by law and guarantee utility of the economic space. Together, this provision performs the same constitutional function as the Article 101 and 102 of DMA combined with the Protocol 27, but in the single integrated text. The competition law of 2023 operationalized this mandate. The statutory architecture follows. This table maps every DMA obligations against Uzbekistan legal frameworks. This table maps every DMA obligation against Uzbekistan legal framework. 6 green cells indicate genuine coverage. Digital platform definition in Article 4 of the computational law. Dominance determination procedure under the Cabinet Resolution 256. The AI exclusive decision prohibition introduced in January 2026. Marketplace operator duties under the e-commerce law. Senior bargaining power doctrine under the Article 14, and regulatory sandbox operational since 2021. 2 yellow cells, portal coverage. 7 red cells, complete absence. The aggregated score is 50, maybe 3%. As you can see that our work. But the pattern matters more than the numbers. Green cells confirm that the definitional and institutional foundation is in the place. Red cell maps precisely where the legislative intervention is needed. Now, reverse perspective. Four instruments exist in Uzbekistan, but found not counterpart in the DMA. First, the AI exclusive decision prohibition. What is interesting in Uzbekistan with this? As last time I told you. Article 7.1 of the informational law. Bar legally significant decision based solely on the algorithm output. Second, the mandatory e-commerce resistancy requirement gives the regulator jurisdiction over the platform without local presence. Third, a dedicated cybersecurity experience procedure under the 2022 security law subjects platform infrastructure to state audit. And the fourth, the last one, is the AI sandbox operational since the 2021. Provides a controlled environment for testing platform innovation under the regulatory supervision. There are not gaps, there are original solutions that divert attention from the policymakers conducting at the Article 53 evaluation. The DMA produces real consequences. Apple received a 500 million euro fine for anti-stealing violations. Meta faced with 200 million for the inadequate consent model. There are operational enforcement outcomes, not theoretical provisions. I present these figures to pose a practical question. Which specific mechanism pursue rules? Turnover-based sanctions, iterative compliance monitors. Can smaller jurisdictions adapt at their own scale? Uzbekistan computational law imposed fixed fines under the Chapter 7 and 8. The gap is not a legal awareness. It is a proportionality of sanctions to the global platform revenue. It means that in Uzbekistan we provided the fines, but they are very low to compare to the European Union fines. You know, it's only in a calculation in our money, it's approximately $10,000. It's very low fine, so it's not adequate for the platform. This slide may be the most important for understanding the current regulatory moment. On 9th November of 2025, the Commission published its Digital Omnibus, a package that repeals the platform to business regulation, amends the GDPR, and poses certain AI Act obligations. The Draghi report identified regulatory burden as a barrier to European competitiveness. This message is unmistakable. Even the European Union acknowledged the need for the consolidation. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan anticipated this logic, embedding digital norms into general competition status from the outset, rather than building a parallel regulatory framework. The implication for both sides is significant. I recognize it is unconventional for the Central Asia scholar to suggest the European Union to learn something from our region. But evidence support for the four propositions. First, integrate codification. Platform regulation was incorporated into competitional law from the day one. The very consolidation of the digital omnibus now perceived retroactively. Second, legislative speed. Amendment cycles measured in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan by months give a regulatory agility. Then the multi-year European Union legislative procedures cannot match. Third, early AI governance. Both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan enacted AI-specific legislation before the DMA review and raised the question of algorithmic competition. And the final, fourth, jurisdictional reach. The e-commerce residency requires solves the enforcement problems that DMA gatekeepers threshold leaves open. These are arguments for dialogue, not superiority. Let me equally candid about what we lack. The DMA Articles 5 through 7 impose obligation and prohibition that prevent harm before it occurs. Every Central Asia jurisdiction, without exception, relies on export enforcement under the general competition law. The damage is done before any investigation begins. Three institutions are more urgently needed. First, ex-ante behavioral rules for dominant platform operators, not for the full gatekeepers designation regime, but specific prohibitions on self-preferencing, typing, and data silence. Second, enforceable users' rights over the personal data accumulated by the platforms. Third, sanctions calibrated to the global turnover rather than the fixed domestic amounts. What is interesting, the geopolitical context shapes how we can transplant this. I have argued the methodological grounds. Let me make the geopolitical dimensions. President Trump threatened immediate and substantial retaliation against the European Union. Tariff package up to the $200 billion, precisely because of DMA enforcement against American technology companies. Central Asia has neither the diplomatic leverage nor the economic scale to absorb such retaliation. China's experience demonstrates that aggressive platform regulation can chill domestic innovation ecosystems. For recipient markets, The prudent path is to embed platform specific application within existing competition frameworks, achieving consumer protection without provoking a trade confrontation. This is not weakness, it is a strategic calibration. The prescription that follows reflects the logic. We are going to the final. There are concrete stage-specific prescriptions. For Uzbekistan, 3 surgical amendments to the competitional law, ex-ante behavioral rules for dominant platforms, enforceable use data rights, and turnover calibrated sanctions. For Kazakhstan, accelerate the 6 anti-monopoly packages already before Parliament, because they already 3 months is discussing about this anti-monopoly regulation, and its main idea is about to regulate the platform. For Kyrgyzstan adopts the new computational law, but it's it's made it on in the past, and it needed to be upgraded. That passes first reading in the March. A structurally advanced draft in the region. And for Uzbekistan is prioritized broadband exception and digital literacy as the prerequisite sites for effectiveness market regulations. And for the Turkmenistan, the OSCE anti-monopoly seminar held in Ashgabat in March 2026 signals the emerging institutional opening. WTO preparation offers the framework for the foundational competition norm. It means that Turkmenistan also started to go to enter into the world economy. Differential policy for differential regions. I return to where I began. Can a recipient market adopt a specific DMA institution without replicating the entire architecture? After examining 5 jurisdictions against the DMA benchmark, my answer is yes, through the selected transplant. 3 conclusions. First, recipient markets need a hybrid model. Specific behavioral norms integrated into the computational law, not a standard law instrument mirroring the DMA institutional complexity. Second, the minimum sufficient regulatory foundation is not for status, is for status. Competition, personal data, cybersecurity, and AI governance. Uzbekistan already possesses all 4. Third is the dialogue is a genius reciprocal. The European Union gains a perspective absent from its review process. The view from the consumer markets without domestic gatekeepers. Central Asia gains institutional perception without regulatory overreach. Professor Hoeren's LDE program embodies this exchange. Thank you very much for listening to me.
So, thank you. Thank you for being in time. That is what Germans love. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and it's rather complicated to ask questions. But you are invited to talk to us as well as the people in the internet. Do I see any questions of you? Let me see.
For all the model.
So, is there any questions? He tries to provoke you, Mr. Wolf, in saying that Uzbekistan is a master of the DMA, and the European Commission can learn as much as possible from Uzbekistan. Do you think as well?
We can always learn things. So if you want to look at implementations of similar or addressing similar issues as the DMA in other jurisdictions, so after us, I mean, so let's be fair. So the Germans were the first, then it was us. Then you have the UK, because they also have a digital regime, so they had a change, a DMCC. And then Japan as well, because they basically did and they actually both Japan and the UK implemented that in their competition law. I mean, just to be sure that the DMA technically is not competition law. I mean, it's adjacent, but it's not based on the competition rules. And of course, to the things that we can learn, we can always learn. I mean, if you want to go back to the slide 9, I mean, I had a quick look, but if you can go back to slides, because that was the things we can learn, right? So the prohibition of decisions made exclusively by AI systems, that I would think is also outside of the scope of the DMA, but I think there's something in the AI Act, because there's Article 14, which is human oversight. So at least for high-risk systems, there must always be effective human oversight. Then the localization, that's basically more of a data protection, right? So that's also not in the DMA, but I think the GDPR has something on that. I think it's Article 44 and following in the GDPR, because if you send data into another country, then you need that country needs to be covered by an adequacy decision by the Commission, or if not, then you need to have appropriate safeguards. On the dedicated sanction for violations involving AI-driven personal data, I don't know. I'm a one-trick pony. I'm not a data protection lawyer. But I think then the general GDPR would apply, and for the DMA, whether it's AI or not, and then for there is of course also so in the DMA you have Article 5.2, which basically means that that data cannot be processed or combined if it comes from another service via AI without proper consent. At least that we have. And then what was the last thing? Data, okay, local body. Yeah, that we don't have. It's true. I mean, so the DMA is an EU regulation that's directly applicable in all member states, which also means you have private enforcement, right? So if let's say a business user is of the opinion that one of the gatekeepers doesn't comply with an obligation, they can come to us, evidently, but they can also go to court. And then, which has already happened in a couple of cases, can go to court and basically get an injunction or monetary relief or damages from that court. But yes, no, we can always learn. I mean, as I said, we have been in discussions with our British and with our Japanese colleagues, and there's always something to learn. I mean, the DMA itself is a learning experience from what we learned from other jurisdictions, right? It's not that we that we know everything. I would rather say far from it.
There is one question somebody asked in the chat. What criteria were used to determine the quantitative thresholds in the development of the DMA?
Yes, so that's for me. I can explain that. I can explain. That's not exact science. Let's get this out of the way. So you have for the 45 million, that's 10% of the EU population. The 10,000 business users, that's a certain percentage of the. So there was some work done before, but that's a certain percentage of the intensive users of platforms. So that's where that figure comes from. And then as to the monetary one, so the valuation, that's basically the average valuation of the top 50 in the Euro stocks at the time. I don't know where they are right now, haven't done the math, but basically that's what those figures refer to. As I said, not exact science, but those were the ones where we and then later on the legislator felt that's sufficiently big. I mean, one of the things that always comes up from our American friends is, oh, you're only targeting US companies. I mean, of course, if we really wanted to do that, then I think we should have gone way higher with our thresholds. Because I mean, so if you say we only want Google, Apple, and Co., then I think we should have gone for not for billions, but for trillions. But okay. But that's where these figures come from. As I said, not exact science, but basically a rough ballpark figure for that they have is, basically, as I said, they reflect the criterion 3.1, so that they are basically, once you have a certain size, then it can be assumed that you have an important impact on the internal market. And then for the business users, end users, as I said, it's basically 10% of the population of the EU.
There's one question in the chat. They're all your old side. That's your mistake. Somebody, Stefan Kraus, asked on the topic of always learning, what was the most persuasive argument you heard during the legislative process from industry stakeholders that actually led you to adjust your position? And which arguments were convincing but not sufficiently? That's again a question to Commission.
Yes. I mean, so it's interesting in the sense that the DMA, to a large extent, the legislative process took place during COVID. So I think there was less lobbying than normally. But that being said, I mean, so we do a first draft, right? And then we are not the legislator. The legislator is Parliament and Council. And of course, to the extent to which they have lobbied, I don't know, I wasn't there. I know that there might be certain things that have come in via member states, but I don't know for 100%. Of course, they also talk to us. But for most of the obligations, I mean, most of these obligations are basically the quintessence of what we learned in antitrust proceedings. So I think we had a relatively good feeling of what we wanted, what we didn't want. So we didn't change. I mean, I don't think we changed too much, but as I said, it's also not up for us to change, because once our proposal is out, that's it. And then it's for Council and Parliament to do that. And of course, I'm pretty sure if you look at the amount of counter proposals that were in the respective committees of the Parliament, there was certainly some lobbying going on, but this was also condensed then to a smaller version. So I think overall, this might be one of the processes where certainly from the gatekeepers, future gatekeepers position, their lobbying wasn't so successful, because I'm pretty sure they would have liked to have much less.
Thank you. I have one question to Zaid and then to you. You mentioned sandbox.
Yes.
And sandbox is a typical model of Russian legislation, to say sandboxes in the area of AI regulation. Can you explain to students here what is meant with sandbox? And then we ask Mr. Wolf why this topic is missing in the DMA.
I will explain in English. Okay. In Uzbekistan, we are using the international standards that AI and any technology can harm the people. And especially in Uzbekistan, Central Asia, we are not highly developed, and the people do not have the real cyber hygiene culture. Like we talked about, Professor just talked about the culture. I mean, the cyber hygiene culture. And that's why in Uzbekistan, when this, after the 2017, when we started the real development, a lot of different types of technologies started to enter into Uzbekistan, especially from China. For example, for medical stuff, this different kind of technologies came. Mass technologies started to come to Uzbekistan. And what is the problem was that our agency of standardization didn't have the specialists and standards to check this. Is the quality and the how to say effect of this technology, how it's work. And then because to find the specialists it's a problem, they decided to put all this technology first to the sandbox. Then they will test it in 3 months. And after 3 months, if there is no any harm, any problem, then they can use it with the people. It started with the in 2019. Started with the red tech technologies in the financial system. It was the first cybersecurity law in the bank system. And after 2019. We had several degrees which connected with the human rights, because not only AI started to violate, but the technologies which were not connected with AI, but technologies which using in the medicine, in pharmacy, in the streets they're using in different. They started to harm the people. Too many compliance started, and then we have the special agency. Who is working together with the central bank. I will introduce next time when we will have some time. All the sandboxes is now coordinating by this agency. It's in English it will be NAPU. It means a National Agency for Perspective Projects. They're testing all these new technologies.
So, Mr. Wolf, why is sandbox topic missing in the DMA?
Yes, so I think the reason for that is what the DMA is basically. It reflects the experience of about 20 years of enforcement of antitrust cases in the EU and beyond. And so I think we had a relatively good idea of what we wanted and what we didn't want. And of course, the DMA doesn't. So the DMA is also narrow in the sense that it only applies to the things that are in there. So to the extent there's behavior relating to other services that are no core platform services or other players, and then of course we still have competition. Then we still have normal competition law as a fallback. So for us, I mean, it's basically a list of, as the commissioner always said at the time, it's a list of do's and don'ts, and that's the things that we know, and those are the things we don't want to see anymore. I don't know whether one needs a regulatory toolbox. I mean, what we have, of course, is we have the regulatory dialogue with these companies. So in the time before the obligations apply to them, we have discussed with them a lot, and we continue also because because products also develop, and so it's basically an ongoing dialogue. But we talk to companies. It's also not that we find them immediately, but basically, if there's a good phase effort, we'll talk to companies. We talk to other stakeholders, and then hopefully arrive at a solution where we have compliance. I mean, it's one of the goals that we have, which is also sometimes a bit badly portrayed on the American side, is what we want is compliance. So we're not interested in fines. Fines is basically it's the stick once the compliance or the regulatory dialogue doesn't work. But I don't know whether we would need a sandbox for that, because as I said, the behavior that's covered we know relatively well. I mean, there can be issues in terms of implementation, but for that there's the dialogue. So I don't know whether we would need a box for that.
Thank you very much. There's a last question. There's a lady still yawning. You.
Yeah.
No, behind you.
So
last question. Last question, then we are finished. Question is, what are the key gatekeeper companies in Central Asia? Are these the major US companies like Google and Facebook, or are there other players who may even play a more significant role? And in this regard, is there a single cross-border Central Asian market dominated by local players, or does each country have its own players? That's the last question for you to answer.
Today, you already give an answer to this question. The global companies dominating in Uzbekistan, not only in Central Asia, because we don't have our own gatekeepers companies, real gatekeepers. We have the local, but they're, how to say this? We have companies who is working in our region, but if we calculate by the DMA, European Union DMA law, it's like baby to these companies. You know, it's compared to the Google, compared to Microsoft, it's you know, they have $1 trillion budget. Our companies maybe several $1 million. They're just startups and starting to work. That's why dominating the global companies in Uzbekistan, it's not a problem. It is, but they are not following the rules because in Uzbekistan we don't have. We are like right now like the polygon for the AI. American, European, Japanese, they are testing the AI results in Uzbekistan. Why? Because we don't have any legislation which protect people from the AI knowledge. Even that what they are accepting, what they are doing, it's not working. Just declared it. And any phone who the guys is using here, any place in Uzbekistan, anytime the Google can watch you, and for example, you ask something or you just talk with somebody, in 10 minutes, you can follow your network. You can see the advertising, what just talked together. And this is, you know, that in European Union, it's prohibited and it's, they can even go to the jail for this. But in Uzbekistan, it's not. And everybody is smiling for this. But in case it is the violating of our rights, but people do not understand because there is no culture of personal data hiding, you know.
Okay, that's the last question being answered. I thank you all for your patience. It was a long session and really high standard. Thank you for your patience in the internet. We see each other next week. I'm coming to Germany again, and I'm as well speaking a little bit of practical matters of the DMA. And then we change to go, I think, to Data Act, that will be the next topic. Mr. Wolf gets our special gift from ITM. That is perfectly clear. I hope you liked all the experience. Somebody asked, can I come at 4 o'clock from Europe to Tashkent to come to this meeting? I can only say if you manage to be here until 4 o'clock Tashkent time from Europe, you can all attend, but it's of course only a meeting for the Tashkent people. I hope you have seen a little bit of the spirit of LDE, which is the spirit of communication, transcontinental. You are heartily invited to join the program. Come. It's becoming better. Sometimes it's boring, but it will become better.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you to Said Gulyamov. Thank you to Gunnar Wolf. See you in the
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Let me thank you for perfect one. Ben